Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for today's Fulton Lecture. As brief background, the Maurice and Muriel Fulton Lectureship in Legal History was created in 1985 by a gift from one of our alums, Maurice Fulton, who was a member of the class of 1942, and his wife, Muriel, who was an alumna of our college. And the goal of the Fulton Lecture is to each year bring a prominent legal historian to the law school to give a lecture. So in recent years, we've had topics in legal history ranging from propaganda and civil liberties in World War I, the development of the United States Constitution and its meaning, the impacts of Presidents Johnson and Nixon on the contemporary Supreme Court. Now, this year, we're delighted to welcome Professor Maurice Bilder, the Founders Professor of Law at the Boston College of Law, here to give our today's Fulton Lecture. Professor Bilder is a leading scholar of early American constitutional history. She's done path-breaking work on the framing generation, Native nations and the Constitution, the constitutional status of women, and James Madison's notes on the Convention. So a range of topics. She's also the author of Madison's Hand and the recipient of the Bancroft Prize, as well as the Transatlantic Constitution and Female Genius. Now, her scholarship has been featured by national institutions, including the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and she served as a legal history consultant to Steven Spielberg's Amistad. Now, we're honored to have her with her today to share her insights on the Constitution and the founding era. The lecture is going to be The Perils of Sex, Catharine Macaulay's Constitution of Liberty. One brief note, Professor Bilder edited the primary document that she's going to be talking about, and we have a QR code here if you want to scan it to take a look at the primary document that we're going to be talking about. However, the QR code's about to go away after the lecture starts because I presume other slides are going to be coming your way. All right, thanks a lot, and thanks for being here, Professor Bilder.
I'll give everybody a second. It always takes me a while to get that QR code, and so I'm going to take a second, and I'm going to open my water. And thanks so much to the university I've never had a QR code instead of just a handout, so I feel very fancy and modern, and I like the riff on my own slides. Is everybody who wants it got it? Okay, let me see if I can get to my first slide. Okay, there's my opening slide. Well, my thanks to the dean and to Allison for inviting me, and to so many friends for being here today. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm going to talk about a piece of writing by the 18th century British constitutional historian Catharine Macaulay, and you see her there. I wrote about her in my latest book, Female Genius, and since then I've written several articles about aspects of her history of England. And today I'm going to talk about her plan of government. Now, at the outset, let me explain. I have a picture book approach to talks with multiple images. I'm usually happiest if I'm on the side and no one looks at me. So everybody should direct their attention at one of the things. I don't actually like being looked at, so this is my strategy. So there's lots of images, and they're going to move kind of fast. The project will hopefully be a small edited volume with chapters to be used in classrooms for UVA Press, and I really look forward to your thoughts. So in the spring, and I'm going to stay with my text because the dean told me to come in at 35 minutes, and otherwise I'll just riff and we'll be here all day. So forgive me for that. In the spring of 1767, an anonymous author published a political pamphlet advocating a democratical plan of government. The pamphlet was 39 pages long, and it included a rebuttal of Thomas Hobbes' theory of government and a plan for a republican form of government, referred to by the author as a democratical form. The Liberty cap on the title page told readers that the pamphlet was published under the auspices of the publishing efforts of Thomas Hollis. And Hollis had embarked on a plan to promote liberty, always with a capital L, including republication of great texts by Milton, Locke, and Sidney, new texts by modern Republican authors, as well as eventually reprinting texts by American proto-revolutionaries. Within a month, Catharine Macaulay had revealed herself to be the author, and a new edition of the pamphlet appeared in 1769, including letters between Macaulay and American Benjamin Rush. Now, this plan is the first plan of government by a British or American woman of which I am aware, and if anyone knows an earlier one, let me know. Not that there weren't theories of government in utopian writing by women, but the two most famous examples by 17th century Mary Astle and 18th century Sarah Scott in Millennium Hall, published in 1762, involved women-only spaces. And the only other constitution-like document is probably the lengthy nakaz, or grand instruction, composed and compiled by Catharine II of Russia, published in Russia in 1767, the same year, and in English in 1768, written brilliantly about recently by Linda Colley. It would be 15 years later, in 1791, the year of Macaulay's death, that Olympe de Gouges rewrote a constitutional text to include women in her Déclaration des droits de la femme de la citoyenne, a genre that would eventually include the 1850 Seneca Falls Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And so Macaulay's plan is thus the first female-authored constitutional plan, and it may be also the only contemporary 18th century plan that explicitly references women. Now, although the plan has been largely forgotten beyond Macaulay scholars, it was once well known. Indeed, one of the anecdotes, nasty and sexist, that was long repeated about Macaulay refers to the plan. As printed in 1780, the joke was a dialogue between two famous actors and theater managers, friends and rivals Samuel Foote and David Garrick. And here's how it went. When a certain celebrated female historian, who has shown more by her literary talents than her prudence, published what she called her loose thoughts, Foote said it was a very improper title for a woman of any modesty to prefix to her work. And Garrick replied he was of a different opinion, for the sooner a woman gets rid of such thoughts, the better. You can laugh. The pamphlet was actually titled Loose Remarks, and that didn't matter. Even nearly 250 years later, we easily grasp the salacious sexual overtones used to dismiss a woman thinking about politics. And Macaulay's 1774 pamphlet, titled A Modest Plea for the Property of Copyright, received similar sexual mockery. Now, the pamphlet's quite interesting, and there's a puzzle about it, one that no scholar to date has noticed. In May 1767, 1 month after publication, Macaulay revealed her authorship. She called the printed version erroneous. Canceled pages, that is, incorrect pages, had been inserted instead of the correct ones. In modern terms, initial erroneous page proofs had ended up being used instead of her corrected ones. And she noted that the difference related to the proposal for provision of widows and the education of female children. And these differences are significant. Scholars who unwittingly use the erroneous edition recently republished by Cambridge Texts find Macaulay's proposal to be anti-feminist, while scholars who end up using the 1769 version republished in the United States in part find her to be proto-feminist. So today I'm going to talk about her pamphlet, her plan, and the puzzling correction. It came 2 years after Macaulay had begun to identify herself publicly as the Libertas, and you see her in this engraving that appeared in her constitutional history. And I'm not going to talk about all the dimensions of the pamphlet, although I'm happy to answer questions about it, but I'm going to discuss how that error offers us an unprecedented opportunity to understand Macaulay's extraordinary recognition of the way that Republican government related to women, and her deep desire for women to have the same independence as men in the democratical political state. And I believe her pamphlet raises important questions about how do we understand the American tradition of constitutional liberty. And because I'm an impatient listener, and I always like to know where the speaker's going, there's the plan. So, who was Catharine Macaulay? Macaulay was born in 1731. She would die 60 years later in 1791. Between 1763 and 1768, she wrote the first 4 volumes of her important History of England. which defended the 1649 regicide during the English Civil War and argued for the inherent inerrancy of monarchical government. I believe she was the first constitutional historian, particularly with respect to developing and describing the Constitution in the sense in which Americans would come to understand it as fixing enforceable limits on power with power in the people. She was included in Richard Samuel's famous painting of the extraordinary women, intellectual, and art leaders of the 1770s. But by the time of her death in 1791, she had become exceptionally controversial. You see that in the label on the print from the British Museum, describing herself as historian and controversialist. And I think some of us would love to become controversialists. That was in part largely due to her second marriage in 1778 to William Graham, a Scotsman considerably younger than she. She was 47, he was 21. He was the younger brother of a married close friend, Dr. James Graham, who promoted vegetarianism, exercise, and cold water, but had also built a temple of health with a celestial bed in which electricity was thought to encourage the couples having sex to have greater fertility. She was publicly canceled in modern terms with sexualized depictions that would bring a blush even to modern sensibilities. But she was famous beyond anything we can imagine in her day. Everyone knew of her. She was greatly admired by the politically interested on both sides of the Atlantic. John Adams and Mercy Otis Warren, the Lees of Virginia, John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson, all were fans. And I've argued elsewhere that she influenced American revolutionaries and the Declaration of Independence, and indeed that it uses similar vocabulary and theory to her history. In the 1780s, she visited the United States and spent a week at Mount Vernon. She wrote an important book on female education that she began in 1787 and published in 1790. She inspired Mary Wollstonecraft, and you see a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft's letter to her. She wrote an important critique of Burke's reflections on the French Revolution, but she died before the French Revolution's turn to dramatic violence, and as her political writing continued, therefore, to embrace Republican democracy, she fell out of fashion, and she was written off in sexist terms by 19th and 20th century historians. So let me tell you something about the pamphlet. It had two parts. The first part was a rebuttal to Hobbes, or as she put it, loose remarks on certain positions to be found in Mr. Hobbes's Philosophical Rudiments of Government and Society. This part summarized Hobbes's philosophical rudiments, more popularly known as De Cive, published in 1642. And she used the 1651 edition. You see the frontis here with religion, dominion, and liberty depicted, published in the same year as Leviathan. And the second part was a short sketch of a democratical form of government in a letter to Signor Paoli. And this sketch was a silent revision in response to James Harrington's Commonwealth of Oceania. And we see here the famous 1747 printing of the John Toland collection, which led Harrington's work to become the backbone of Republican politics. Pasquale Paoli was the elected leader of the brief Republic of Corsica. Now, Hobbes and Harrington were political thinkers linked by the regicide and the British Commonwealth government. Hobbes's theories supported monarchy, and he indeed fled before the regicide and then became a tutor to the future Charles II. Harrington had published Oceania as a model in 1656 for a Commonwealth government, but he too had served as companion to the imprisoned Charles I. And so for Macaulay, Hobbes was the defender of monarchical government and a critic of democratical forms. Harrington was an erstwhile defender of the Republic and theorist of Republican constitutionalism. And she concisely offered a critique of the theory that underpinned monarchy and then presented a plan for a democratical government. Now, loose remarks is very interesting. She read Hobbes in a highly selective way and very much as a woman and a new mother. She argued against dominion, that is the way in which one man claimed authority over others, we might call this patriarchal dominion, and monarchical government, the rule of one. And here are a few quotes to give you a flavor, and I'm not going to read the first two. She thought about authority based on reciprocal relationships of benefits and obligations, analogous to parents as benefactors, whose job was to give advice but not command. She rejected Hobbes's belief that the state of equality is a state of war, which, as she pointed out, he just asserts. By her own assertion, political equality is the essential pair for good government. And throughout, she insists that monarchy brings inevitable corruption, and I'm going to read this one. Now, the designs of an individual being commonly to gratify his own lusts and private advantages, it leads him to employ those villains whose abilities are equal only to cunning and proper only to the destruction of the Commonwealth. And I will refrain from modern political commentary. Emerging from her critique is her own theory. Humans are born with reason. Political equality is the fundamental basis of good government. The rights of people, or she says men, are a fundamental value. And a government of limited authority in which the people continue to hold absolute authority is the only form consistent with these premises. And thus Macaulay's plan was for a type of republic, a democratical system rightly balanced, as she called it. She insisted on three parts: the democratical form of government, rotation of all positions of trust, and an agrarian on proper balance. So as to the governmental form, it was a representative assembly, elected from the people, which had all the decision-making power. The Senate, elected by the people from the representatives, had only debating and advising capacity. She insisted on rotation. Everyone served 3-year terms with a mandatory 3 years out of office. And she included an agrarian, what we would think of as an arrangement of property, without which the system became imbalanced. Its purpose was, as she put it, to prevent extreme disproportion in the circumstances of her citizens, because that would give too much power to the aristocratical party. She wanted the balance to incline in favor of the popular side. She was not a leveler, but she tilted towards greater equality. She got rid of primogeniture and required equal division, possibly multi-generational. And important for today, she excluded women from inheriting or bringing dower. Now, we need to be careful to understand what Macaulay meant within the context of the 1760s. Under 18th century law, women usually never inherited land. Only if there were no male heirs did they inherit, and that gave them the designation as heiress. But when heiresses married, they lost control of their property to their husbands. And on the birth of their children, by iure uxoris, their husbands acquired life interests in their property. And thus Macaulay prohibited women from inheriting. She erased the category of heiress. And second, she barred them from bringing property, dower, to the marriage as a condition of marriage. And again, dower was not property that women controlled, but property for their husbands and future sons. And she was focused on preventing the transfer of property on marriage to men through women. Now, why does Macaulay even mention women, which almost no one else ever does, and then bar female inheritance and dower? In large part, she was responding to Harrington, who did reference women in two places. First, Harrington's famous example of how to divide, one person divides the cake and the other picks, was actually written using female pronouns. And indeed, he noted the scheme was known even to girls. And second, when he described his agrarian, he insisted that an heiress should nonetheless enjoy her lawful inheritance, thus being free to marry somebody, and a widow whatever amount her husband decided to leave her. Macaulay rejected both of these positions, and this rejection arose from her brilliant understanding about the relationship between women and the political state. Now, let me talk about her family history. Macaulay develops her insight from her own experience, particularly her family history. She grew up at Allanty, and it was a magnificent Palladian-style house and property in Kent. It had a hill called Barrow Hill, which everybody thought had been the burial site for ancient people. Her family was landed gentry. We see here a print in the seats of the nobility and gentry, with Ollantay being described as the seat of John Sawbridge, Esquire. Her grandfather, father, and brothers were esquires, members of parliament, sheriffs. Her brother will be alderman and eventually mayor of London. The family aspired to even more. Her grandfather acquired coats of arms for the family and perpetually hoped to marry someone into the peerage. Now, as a young girl, Macaulay was famously left to her own devices. Her mother died, her father ignored her, her governess was incompetent, and so apocryphally, she read her way through her father's library of political texts. And from an epistemological point of view, I believe that at some point she realized that the books she read reflected male understandings of the political state. That is, that political texts which appeared generic were actually gendered, just gendered male. Or to put it more bluntly, that conventional political thought was actually male political thought. It wasn't universal political thought. Indeed, her family was not actually landed gentry. Ollantay had been purchased by her grandfather only 15 years before Macaulay's birth. Although Jacob Sawbridge would later claim that he had begun the world with a very considerable fortune, that was a gross exaggeration. Sawbridge and a partner, Elias Turner, had acquired a company, the Hollow Sword Blade Company, and they used it as a shell for investment vehicles, and eventually they converted it into the bank for a sister corporation, the South Seas Company. And her grandfather and Elias Turner were two of the three infamous directors of the South Seas Company. Skipping over much history, which I find interesting, as would William, in 1720, they were at the center of the South Sea bubble. And when the South Sea stock arose abruptly, they made money, and then it crashed. A government investigation resulted in her grandfather being imprisoned in the Tower of London and his assets confiscated. He was allowed to keep £5,000 because otherwise he claimed his children would be unprovided for. But the Sawbridge money actually didn't even come from finance. It came from women, more importantly, heiresses and their deaths. So the startup funding for Jacob Sawbridge, her grandfather, came from his marriage to Elizabeth Fisher. There's no portrait of her, so I've used a young girl with a lamb, which was the traditional sign of virginity. She was an heiress, the only child of her father, and she was married to Jacob when she was 16 and a half years old. He was 34. The marriage was consummated, and she gave birth to two sons. Indeed, given the timing of the first son, one wonders if sex preceded the marriage and if indeed the marriage was actually consensual. She died in 1720 at the age of 37. Jacob would go on to live another 30 years. And it was her money that funded Sawbridge's financial activities, probably the purchase of Ollantay. And another heiress marriage was responsible for the asset protection scheme that saved Ollantay from government confiscation. Jacob's son, John Sawbridge, was married in May of 1720 to Elizabeth Turner. She was the daughter of his business partner. She brought a £20,000 dowry and a promise of even more money in a complicated family settlement. And again, the marriage was consummated and she was immediately pregnant. And without going into all the machinations, later that year, as the government began to require the forfeiture of assets, Jacob claimed retrospectively that Ollantay had been transferred to his son at the time of the consummated marriage, which just coincidentally turned out to be 3 days before the eventual agreed on forfeiture date. I'm super suspicious about that. That left Ollantay with what he thought was a male heir, a male grandson, but the baby died. And Ollantay was stuck in limbo without an heir. And for 7 years, Elizabeth never again became pregnant. And then fortuitously, for the Sawbridge men, in the Gothic version, they kill her. She dies at 27. John Sawbridge quickly marries again. This is Macaulay's mother, the heiress Dorothy Wanley. She was 15 years old. There's no portrait, so I'm using young girl with cherries. It's worth noting that even William Blackstone called a girl of 16 only a woman child. She was the only child of the exceptionally wealthy banker George Wanley, whose firm would later become Gosling's and Barclay. She brought a 30,000-pound dower, and her dad died almost immediately, leaving by will all his money to John. And just like the others, she was immediately pregnant. Birth of a daughter, Dorothy, at 16, Catharine Macaulay's born at 17, a son, John, at 18, a spare son at 19, Wanley, at which point she died in childbed. Catharine grew up going to the church at Y, where the death panels for all three women were displayed in the sanctuary. The wealth that supported her family had all come from the death of young female heiresses. And as Catharine grew older, that family pattern continued. When she was 15, her heiress cousin, orphaned by the death of her own mother in childbed, was married to the West Indian planter, the widower William Young. We see her in the famous Johann Zoffany painting, The Family of Sir William Young, done about the time that Macaulay writes Loose Remarks. The three male heirs and 5 daughters are shown. Her cousin is thought to be pregnant again and looks miserable. The land and country houses show elite status, as does the inclusion of John Brooke, who was born enslaved on Young's West Indian plantations. And when Macaulay was 25, another heiress cousin was married, Katie Montgomery. She was 16 years old. She was married to another Caribbean enslaver, Chris Molyneux. She was pregnant almost immediately with 4 children in 5 years, profoundly unhappy. She finally runs away from her husband. John Wilkes's daughter, Polly, would refer to her throughout her life as the widow. Now, Macaulay was aware of this pattern. She and her sister both took steps to marry late. Her sister doesn't marry till 30. She marries at 29. Macaulay married a man midwife, an obstetrician, George Macaulay. He was Scottish, 15 years older than her, and a widower, but he had done path-breaking work to try and make childbirth safe for women. And he worked at the newly founded British Lying-in Hospital. He was the first person to perform a controversial operation that put the life of the mother above the life of the baby. Both sisters did not become immediately pregnant, and both will eventually only have 1 daughter. In contrast, their brother embraced the family pattern. He married a fabulously wealthy heiress, Diana Bridgman. She was 37 years old, 6 years his senior. Her father was a baronet. Her mother was the daughter of the Earl of Bradford. She may not have ever wanted to be married. There is a silver tea set in existence engraved with her own initials as a single woman. And tragically, she died 2 months after the wedding, and one wonders about ectopic pregnancy, known to be a universally fatal condition in this situation. She, too, was buried with a death panel in the Y Church. Now, this pattern was for Macaulay, I believe, recognition, or anagnoresis, although the term postdates her. Her family's pattern made visible that the 18th century constitutional state depended on sexual intercourse and its gendered perils to ensure the accumulation and transmission of property and male power. Macaulay recognized that the state derives its power from property, and if so, then it was founded on coverture. Women's property became their husband's. They became one person at marriage, the husband. The wife's property was that of the husband. The wife had no legal existence apart from her husband. And because this property transmission depended on marriage, it depended on legally mandated sex. Now, curiously, there was no actual explicit legal requirement for sexual intercourse to consummate the marriage, but the unconsummated marriage could be annulled, and contested property thus depended on consummation. And moreover, property descended to male issue, and so sex was the purpose of marriage, and that's why marital rape conceptually was not considered a legal category in this world. And thus it was all founded on the perils of sex for women. Sex raised the statistically significant possibility of maternal death. Now, statistics are complicated for this period, but historians estimate a lifetime risk for women of 5 to 6%, or 8 to 10 deaths per 1,000 women. First births were particularly dangerous. 15 deaths per 1,000 women. And by comparison, the largest cause of death today in the United States is heart-related, and that's at 1.5% per 1.5 people per 1,000. Being young, being 16, being unable to space out the births raise the risk. A recent study suggests that in this period, mothers' risk of death exceeded fathers by at least 10%, and their mortality in the process of pregnancy in the month or so afterwards was more than 40%. Not only was pregnancy in the process of giving birth dangerous, but puerperal fever and postpartum hemorrhage claimed many lives. In a world without effective means for women to refuse sex or prevent having to carry to viability, the state, particularly aristocratic accumulation leading to political power, rested on the perils of sex for women and maternal morbidity. And so when Macaulay turned to a plan for democratic liberty, she thought about women. She imagined what liberty would look like for women, a political state without coerced female marital sex and death. She thought about Hobbes' theory of dominion as the basis of the state, and Harrington's insistence in the Agrarian that heiresses should be able to inherit and widows only given what their husbands want. And she thought about her own family history of woman after woman married too young for money and dying, while the men grew ever more politically powerful. And so she excluded women from inheriting or bringing dower. She doesn't attack coverture directly and involve many, many different legal principles. And so she did it indirectly. Women can't own property outright as married women, and thus they should not be able to transmit it to men. In awkward language originally, she even tried to protect women from having to marry. She suggested an annuity for women through natural defect, not capable of marriage. And then before publication, Macaulay's status changed dramatically, reinforcing her recognition. Her husband died, and she became a widow with a 1.5-year-old daughter. She inherited limited property, the lease on the House of London and his personal property. To raise funds, she puts his entire library up for auction. She had brought a dowry of £5,000 to the marriage, but it's in trust for the future children. And so Macaulay alters her text. She pushes to the boundary of her imagination what female liberty could look like. She adds an explanation, lest anyone misunderstand the point of barring inheritance and dower. It isn't anti-feminist. It isn't anti-woman. It isn't because women aren't inferior, are somehow inferior or subordinate. It is to prevent aristocratical accumulation of property. It is to stop women from being pawns in the path of power. If women cannot be married for their money, she thinks then they may gain some degree of independence. She insists on an ample provision for widows and for the education of female daughters. That is, she wants women and young girls to be able to be independent of male discretion. And she reframes her awkwardly phrased final point to be neutral. Unmarried females should get an annuity out of the personal estate. And then Macaulay tries desperately to correct the erroneous section. She has the new section printed. We see the new section here sewn into the pamphlet in the Trinity College copy. She cared enough to try and get rid of the error. And she had several other magazines reprint the corrected sketch. And then she took the opportunity in 1769 to create a second edition, what she called a more perfect edition. The edition included an exchange of letters between Benjamin Rush and Macaulay over her plan. She defended the plan, and she noted that of particular use to the Americans might be what she called the general principles of the rights of mankind that she had discussed in her history. Now, Benjamin Rush is the one who encourages Thomas Paine to write Common Sense and later insisted that it was all his own ideas. Common Sense proposes unicameral assemblies and rotation. John Adams, who had corresponded with her, he was literally like a fanboy, okay? And he wrote what he called a sketch of government in the fall of 1775, later expanded to be his influential thoughts on government. And another writer, Democritus, published loose thoughts on government in a newspaper as the Virginia legislature was meeting to write the new Constitution. And these three early plans are notable in that they all emphasize the people's representation in assembly, annual election, and rotation like Macaulay's. But they are strikingly different in that they completely ignore her engagement with the status of women. So let me close with a few reflections. In 2022, Justice Alito, in the Dobbs opinion overruling Roe, based his opinion on the idea of liberty. He wrote, "In interpreting what is meant by the 14th Amendment's reference to liberty, we must guard against the natural human tendency to confuse what the amendment protects with our own ardent views about the liberty that Americans should enjoy." He went on, "That provision has been held to guarantee some rights that are not mentioned in the Constitution, but any such right must be deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition and implicit in the concept of ordered liberty." And if you know anything about that opinion, you know that he drew his sources from male writers from periods of time dominated by coverture. Indeed, only in 1920, with the 19th Amendment, did the American constitutional state, as a legal matter, reject the political inheritance of coverture when it barred the states from denying the right to vote to people based on sex. In the founding period, no one was as publicly associated with the idea of liberty as Catharine Macaulay. Here we see an image of that association from 1771. John Wilkes is attending the Chevalier d'Eon, who we would understand as genderqueer, who's giving birth to twins, with Paoli, to whom Macaulay dedicated the pamphlet, and herself looking on. She's holding her history of England, which stood for the end of monarchical government, and carrying the liberty pole with the liberty hat. This struggle to live as an independent woman of liberty dominated the remainder of Macaulay's life. In the early 1770s, for a brief while, she lived independently. She built a new house. She furnished it. She held salons. She tried to make money off an independent income from her copyrights. She engaged with contemporary politics. But by 1776, likely to protect her daughter for financial reasons, she moved in with Dr. Wilson in Bath. He adopted her daughter and signed the house over to her. And that relationship has been presumed by historians to have been non-sexual on her part. But nonetheless, the difference in age and his obsessive infatuation with Macaulay became an endless source of gossip, and you see them here portrayed as the political platonic lovers. It's in this period that she ends up close to Dr. James Graham, who is married, likely having written explicit letters to him. After her letters are threatened to be made public by none other than John Wilkes, she marries his much younger brother, resulting in her near banishment from polite society. Nonetheless, throughout the 1780s and 90s, she continued to write on topics of liberty, condemning Burke's position on the French Revolution, advocating for the education of women, for publicly funded education, and against cruelty to animals. In 1767, Catharine Macaulay sketched a rightly balanced democratical government to secure virtue, liberty, and the happiness of society. She recognized that governments proposed by men focused only on male liberty and were based on the denial of liberty to women. She grasped that female liberty would require economic independence, free and equal marriages, control over sex and reproduction. Her plan attempted to sketch a democratical government that just might begin to free women to be independent. She aspired to live with liberty, but her later life showed how difficult that aspiration was. Nonetheless, her plan and its relationship to her family history reminds us that the traditions of liberty are not only found in books written by men, in libraries owned by men. They were passed down also through the minds and bodies of women. And a democratical government, I believe, must embrace these more expansive understandings of liberty. Thank you very much.